On a scale of 1 to 10, how patient would you say that you are? I've already told you I am not very patient. Knowing that I was going to be preaching about waiting on God, I've been mindful this week of that. I can't say it's changed my behavior, but I've been mindful. I found myself one time this week saying to a driver, "Green means go. Go already. There's a reason there's an accelerator in the floorboard." Yesterday, I was out on Wilma Rudolph for an act of mercy. I mean, literally, and I'll tell you about that when it's the offering time. But I was a little bit horrified to hear come out of my mouth, "I don't know who taught you to drive, but if you paid them for it, you deserve a refund." I just struggle. I mean, when I am in stores and there's a long line, once in a blue moon, and I mean maybe once a month, maybe once a quarter, I am able to practice Richard Foster's advice, a wonderful spiritual guru, if you're not familiar with him. And instead of getting impatient, I pray for the people in front of me. I ask for God to bless them. I say, "Don't know what this person has going on in their life, but I pray that you would bless and heal." But friends, I would be lying if I told you I did that on a regular basis. I aspire to, but I don't always, well, I don't do it often. So it made me think, am I alone in my lack of patience? I wonder if the other clergy we have are more patient than I am. And that led me to think of a scenario, and I invite you to put yourself in this scenario and see where you think you would fall. But you have made a decision to go to an event on a Saturday night, and you're in the parking deck waiting to get out, okay? Cars are bumper to bumper, and the person who is currently at the gate is in an extended conversation with the parking garage attendant. I mean, this goes on and goes on. At one point, it looks like they're taking out photos and looking at them. So, how would you respond? Well, I decided that Reverend John Collette would be thinking, you know, one of those people is probably lonely. And they're creating community. This is a beautiful thing. I mean, maybe they'll start a small group and I could be a part of it. John Collette. Now, you may not know Bo Myers as well, since he hasn't been with us as long, but Bo's an introvert and he is quiet by nature. So I'm envisioning Bo would be sitting there thinking of exactly what he is going to say to the attendant when he gets to the gate. Thinking along the lines of, "I noticed you had children. I don't know if you have a church home or not, but Brooke Knight has an amazing program at Madison Street, and we would love for you to come." I don't know what you thought he would be thinking about saying, but that's what I think that Bo would say. I think I would be calculating how much room there was, going, "I drive a Honda Civic. That's a small car. I bet I could maneuver it, and side view mirrors are overrated anyway." I don't really like to wait. I've often thought that when Paul was writing the letter to the Galatians and listed the fruit of the Spirit, he could have left out patience. You know, it's love, joy, peace, patience, kindness, gentleness, self-control. Now, self-control and patience are probably linked. So if I were writing, I would want the fruit of the Spirit to be love, joy, peace, kindness, gentleness. I mean, I think that's enough. But Paul seemed to think that we needed to have all of them and that the Spirit was able to work in us to make that a possibility. Given how little I like to wait, you can imagine that I sympathize with Abraham and Sarah with their extended wait for God to deliver on God's promise that we first heard in chapter 12. Now, my original intent this morning was to walk us from chapter 12 through until we got to chapter 18. You may wish to do this later, you may not, but I will tell you that during this course of waiting, that God keeps showing up, and in the case of chapter 18, sends these visitors that we heard of to repeat the promise to Abraham, to let Abraham know that God is going to deliver on this promise. But Abraham and Sarah, well, they get tired of waiting along the way, and they think maybe God wants us to do our part to help. And so they decide that to expedite matters, since God hasn't delivered on the promise yet, that Hagar will bear a child since Sarah is unable to conceive. And that brings about a whole host of complications. If you come back next week, you'll hear about that. It's just hard for us to wait, for many of us, and yet waiting is important to God, and God built it into both nature and into religion. We wait for babies to be born. We wait for crops to be ready to harvest, for tomatoes to ripen. We know that Abraham and Sarah wait for 25 years for the birth of the child that God promised. We know the Israelites wandered around in the desert for 40 years until they reached the promised land, and that the Israelites, the Jewish people, also waited centuries, the world waited centuries for Jesus to be born. Clearly, waiting is important to God. And one of the hallmarks of spiritual maturity is learning when God is calling us to act and when God is calling us to wait. A couple of weeks ago, we considered that one of the hallmarks of spiritual maturity is learning to accept responsibility for our actions. Last week, I talked about learning to trust God and believing that God is capable of delivering on God's promises. And this week, we're going to talk about why trust is so important. If we're going to distinguish when we are to act and when we are to wait, it means that we have to learn how to recognize God's voice. Now, how do we recognize anyone's voice? If you answer the phone and you know who's on the other end before they identify themselves, well, you know because you've spent time talking with that person, and so the voice is familiar to you. One thing I encourage all of us to remember is that God's voice is never desperate, is never frantic, is never panicky. If you are hearing a voice that is frantic or panicky, that's not God's voice. God will not lead us into a place of desperation. My sheep know my voice, Jesus says in the 10th chapter of John, and it's the voice of the shepherd who cares for the sheep. Always. So keep that in mind. And yet there are times that we are definitely called to act. Our current bishop, Bishop McAlilly, has been known to say more than once that God is telling us to get up off our blessed assurance and move. Some of you took a minute to get that, but there you go. Biblical waiting is not a way to evade an unpleasant reality. There's a time to pray, a time to wait, and there's also a time to act. I am mindful of the problem of hunger in our community and in the U.S. We can pray for people to be fed, yes, but we can also put action behind our words and not wait for God to solve the problem of hunger. I am mindful, and I'm stepping maybe a little into dangerous territory, but as long as I don't tell you what to do in crossing a political threshold, I think I'm okay. Your 501c3 status is okay. But am mindful that there is a special session of our state legislature coming up that focus is to hopefully have greater protection for our children. And so I have written everyone that I can to let them know how I feel, and you might wish to do the same. It's beyond my control what happens, but I feel called to act while we wait. We act when we have responsibility and agency, when there is something that we can do. So for students, let me give you this difference. It's not hoping that you will make good grades. It's not waiting for God to help you pass an exam. It's saying, you know, I think I'm going to study because God has given me a brain and the ability to do that. That's the difference. In knowing, one of the differences in knowing when we act. Abraham and Sarah were waiting for God, but they were also moving. Last week we heard that God said, get up and go, and so they were traveling while they were waiting for God to deliver on God's promises and for that child to be born. So it's a nuanced waiting. Patient waiting is staying in the present moment, and expectant waiting is trusting that this process of waiting on God is going to bear fruit, that God can be trusted, as we considered last week. Waiting teaches us boundaries, humility, and dependence on God. Boundaries, humility, and dependence on God. Boundaries are that we don't act when we are infringing upon someone else's ability to make decisions. Now, I am well aware that I am reading 21st century sensibilities into the ancient world, that it was perfectly acceptable in the ancient world for Hagar to bear a child with Abraham. But as I read that, I do think that a possible interpretation of that is that because Abraham and Sarah were so anxious, they were manipulating the situation. They were trying to force the promise to happen, and they were not waiting on God to act. When we are waiting, we are tempted often to use people instead of to trust that God is at work. It's okay to make suggestions for someone. It's okay to assist someone, but there is a time for us each to take responsibility for our actions. I'm mindful here of parents who have a hard time sometimes letting their children make appropriate decisions, and I'll let you all figure out what that is as a non-parent. Humility. When we're waiting on God, it reminds us of how little we can control. We can control ourselves, we can control our actions, but we can't control other people, we can't control the future, and we can't control outcomes. We can prepare, but we cannot control. We can set aside money for retirement, and then the stock market crashes. We did what we knew to do, but what actually happens is beyond our control. We can make it to the airport on time to catch a flight and find out that it has been delayed due to weather. Again, there are limits to what we can do. Waiting on God reminds us that God is God and that we are not. Waiting teaches us that we are not in control. Lastly, waiting gives us an opportunity to learn to rely upon God, to depend upon God more fully, and to deepen our relationship with God, trusting God with the outcome and the futures. For many of us, this means that we have to let go of fear, that that leads us to panic. Henry Nouwen has written, in our particular historical situation, waiting is difficult for us because we are fearful. One of the most pervasive emotions around us is fear. People are afraid of inner feelings, afraid of other people, and afraid of the future. Fearful people have a hard time waiting because when we are afraid, we want to get away from where we are, and we might respond to the fight or flight response. The more afraid we are, the harder waiting becomes. He tells the story of having known acrobats, and that one of the lessons that they taught him, these trapeze artists, is that when you're on the trapeze, and you are waiting to be caught, you have to wait. That if you reach out before the person is ready, the artist is ready to catch you, you increase the likelihood of falling. So if you're a trapeze artist and you have swung off, the hardest thing in the world, I imagine, I wouldn't do that, but the hardest thing in the world is wait to be caught. And yet, that is how God calls us to wait, trusting that God will catch us. To wait open-mindedly, Nouwen says, is an enormously radical attitude toward life. It's to trust that something will happen to us that's far beyond our own imaginings. It's allowing God to define our lives, trusting that God is molding us according to God's love and not according to our fear. The spiritual life is a life in which we wait, trusting that God will keep God's promises. And Nouwen goes on to write about how important Christian community is, that when we're gathered together, we are able to remind each other of God's past faithfulness so that we can trust God's present faithfulness. I have more to say, and I'm not going to say it. Maybe it'll show up in a future sermon. I don't know. I think I've made some good points, and I see a lot of fans out there. So, the invitation this morning is to consider how easy or hard it is for you to wait on God, to consider how easy or hard it is for you to trust God. I don't know where you are. Maybe you're having a hard time waiting, and it seems like God's taking God's own sweet time. And the message for you is to trust that God is faithful. Maybe share your concerns with someone else who can pray with you and for you. Maybe you're in a good place right now, and God has been faithful. Perhaps you would ask God to show you with whom you might share a story of God's faithfulness, to offer a word of hope to someone else. But the good news for us, friends, always, is that God promises to do more in and through us than we dare dream or imagine. And that is true both individually and collectively as we learn to wait and trust in God. Thanks be to God. Amen.